All seemed normal that spring day. Yakima was enjoying a typical sun-drenched May morning. Hundreds of miles to the west, Mount St. Helens had been belching steam and ash for months. Up to that point, the awakening of Mount St. Helens after years of slumber had not affected Yakima. But that would soon change.
We interrupt this program to bring you this special bulletin just in. There has been a major eruption at Mount St. Helens.
The major eruption of Mount St. Helens came at 8:32 that morning, sending 540 million tons of ash into the air. Hundreds of acres of trees in the blast zone were laid out like so many matchsticks. Swollen rivers filled with mud, ash, trees, and whatever else was in their way. The ash cloud from the eruption drifted eastward and dropped a gritty, sand-like substance on Yakima, causing confusion and turning day into night.
State Patrol says that Chinook and White passes are closed, as is Interstate 82 between Yakima and Ellensburg. The only major highway open at this time is Highway 97 south from Yakima toward the Tri-Cities. It's just like midnight. As those of us in Yakima know, the streetlights have been on since about 10 o'clock this morning, and we haven't seen much of an afternoon. There is heavy smoke and ash up to 4 inches in some places.
The immediate reaction to the ash fall was one of concern, specifically how the ash would affect the health of people in Yakima. But health officials believed that while the ash posed no real danger, it might cause some minor irritation of the nose and throat and some coughing and sneezing.
That is a normal physiologic reaction to any kind of dust in the air. Some increase in difficulty of that kind may occur during the cleanup phase, because what happens when this material is cleaned up is it's the smaller particles that get re-aerosolized.
People were encouraged to wear face masks while they went about cleaning up the ash. Cleanup was the next big concern. The ash was heavy, 95 pounds per cubic foot. There was some worry it would collapse roofs if not removed. The ash was also messy. When moved, the lighter particles of ash became airborne, and huge clouds of ash would fly into the air. Crews from the city began cleaning up the ash almost as soon as it fell, and quickly learned how best to handle it.
We're now in the process with city street crews on beginning a cleanup operation concentrating in the downtown business district. That consists of essentially dampening the ash and sweeping it. We are intending to pick it up and we'll be dumping it away from the immediate city vicinity. We will not be flushing it down any of our storm drainage systems, and we'd also encourage residences not to do that either. In terms of private cleanup, we would urge that you follow a similar procedure, dampening initially or sprinkling with water, and then pushing it aside to a stockpile in the yard or whatever.
To make the cleanup easier, 16 blocks of downtown Yakima were closed off so crews could work quickly and safely. But soon after the cleanup began, city leaders discovered they needed help to tackle a job that was bigger than anyone could have imagined. Equipment and crews from other cities and even other states were called in. Private contractors also helped with the cleanup. Within less than a week, the downtown area was once again open for business. The airport was reopened after a 7-day closure, and Yakima appeared to have only limited effects from the ashfall. But the bill for the cleanup was steep. and federal and state agencies assisted only some in helping Yakima meet the financial costs of the cleanup.
The city faced a general cleanup expenditure of about $2 million. The reimbursement that has come to us from the federal government has helped offset maybe 60% of that cost. Otherwise, the city has received some additional grants and aid from other federal or state agencies, but by and large, our bottom line cost is about $445,000 of that $2 million we're having to absorb. We did not qualify for any state funding, which is a tremendous disappointment to us. In fact, I think it's somewhat unfair that this community, impacted as it was, doesn't qualify for any state assistance. So we're having to evaluate what's the best way to pay for that. We have drawn down our contingency reserves to help pay for part of that, and had to take out an interfund loan from another enterprise fund of the city. It will ultimately impact our 1982 and 83 budgets as we have less resources available to the city for general operations to pay those ash-related costs.
The ash also had ill effects on the city's wastewater treatment plant. Despite repeated warnings from city leaders not to flush ash into the city storm drains, many residents did so anyway. The ash ended up at the wastewater treatment plant, clogging equipment and causing the plant to be shut down. Sewage had to be pumped directly into the Yakima River to avoid any further damage to the plant. The city had to repair and even replace some expensive equipment at the plant. Yet another unexpected cost. When all was said and done, cleanup crews had scooped up enough ash from city streets to fill a dump truck like the one seen here 85,000 times. There was also concern that the ash might significantly damage the Yakima area's leading industry, agriculture. The thousands of acres of fruit trees in the Yakima Valley were coated with ash. No one knew what effect the ash might have on crops, but growers were convinced they needed to get the ash off the trees by whatever means possible.
I spent most of the day yesterday with a speed sprayer just going through and blowing the trees off.
And was that effective?
Somewhat. The dust is still on the leaves, but the majority of the ash and the heavy stuff I think has been blown off.
But most growers found blowing the ash off the trees with wind machines didn't work very well. The wind machines only moved the ash from one place to another.
I think any action with attempt to blow or knock the residue off the fruit, you look at the fruit and it still is coated. So I think any exercise with wind is an exercise of futility.
Quick analysis of the chemical makeup of the ash indicated the composition was very similar to the native soil found throughout the Yakima area, a region formed over thousands of years of volcanic deposits. Based on that, scientists felt the ash would likely be good for crops in the long run. Early reports by some newspapers on the west side of Washington state that farms were dying proved completely false. While growers did have some fruit fall off trees due to the sheer weight of the ash, the effect on crops was limited. The biggest effect the ash had on growers was clogged air filters on tractors and equipment breakdowns. There were those in Yakima who saw the Mount St. Helens ash fall not as a disaster, but as an opportunity. Even as the cleanup was still underway, some creative entrepreneurs were working on ways to turn the ash into cash. Once the ash was cleaned up, other folks tried to capitalize on Yakima's misfortune. Snow-Kissed Growers, a Yakima fruit packing and shipping company, put ash into cans usually used for fruit and sold them. Snow-Kissed was not just interested in making a profit, but also in paying homage to the role volcanoes had played in making the Yakima Valley one of the leading agricultural regions in the world.
We wouldn't be here, and Yakima wouldn't be here if it weren't for the ancient volcanic eruptions that deposited the rich soil that we have that grows the quality fruit in this valley. Snow-Kissed Growers is not interested in the gimmick aspect of it. What we are interested in is the story that this is where our quality comes from. And this we'd like to be able to share with people, and on the labels of this product is a little bit about this story that I'm discussing.
Another entrepreneur named Hannah Claus proposed partnering with the city to build factories in Yakima to turn the ash into a miracle plastic through a secret process. Claus claimed to be a scientist and at first was extremely cordial with city officials while trying to win their support. But when city leaders questioned Claus's credentials and his secret formula and said no to his proposed partnership, Claus was less than cordial.
Now I'm getting antagonized with this.
Okay.
I've been shot at. I've been trying to, people have been trying to grab me off because I possess a plastic that no one else got and everyone wants.
Quite the opposite was true of two teachers from Texas who drove to Yakima hoping to take bags full of the ash back home to share with their students. The teachers found Yakima more than willing to part with some ash and were appreciative indeed.
So far, they have not charged me. They've been really, really generous with offering it. I've never seen a town that was as good about giving things away. You have a marvelous attitude.
That positive attitude would prove to be key in Yakima's continuing effort to recover from the Mount St. Helens ashfall. Mount St. Helens had tested the tenacity of the people of Yakima in almost unimaginable ways. It had pushed the abilities of city government to new heights and had brought the community together. A year after the mountain had dumped hundreds of tons of ash on the city, local leaders sang the praises of the people of Yakima.
Once the people kind of had a handle on how it would affect them and how to go about cleaning it up, you just can't brag enough, really, about how this community came together.
I think the city looks good as a result of cooperative efforts between the government and the private citizenry pulling together and bringing the community up to the standard that we now enjoy.
The people were concerned the day of the eruption, but the day after the eruption they were all out seeing what they could do to help, and without the effort of all the people of the county and the urban area, that we wouldn't have been able to get on our feet as fast as we did, and I thought they did a remarkable job of cleaning up.
No, I'm very proud of this community and how it did. Anywhere we went during that time, there was nothing but cooperation.
Our Public Works Department did an exceptional job. They spent many hours on and above the hours they normally work to address the situation at the time. We put in the extra effort of cleaning, working the roads, cleaning out the bar ditches. I think overall it was an exceptional job, especially by the people that assisted us in the outlying areas.
Today, Yakima is again the vibrant focal point of central Washington that it has always been. The city is thriving almost as if the historic ashfall had never happened. Some who live in Yakima today weren't here when Mount St. Helens erupted and know little of the crisis caused by a volcano hundreds of miles away. The effects of the ashfall from Mount St. Helens are largely gone, but the memory of that quiet Sunday morning when the sky turned black and the ash began to fall will never be forgotten.
Hello and welcome to this edition of Yakima Agenda. At 8:32 a.m. on Sunday, May 18, 1980, a massive eruption rocked Mount St. Helens, sending a towering plume of ash 15 miles up into the atmosphere. The ash cloud, pushed by strong easterly winds, headed toward Yakima. By mid-afternoon, ash-filled clouds hung above the Yakima Valley, and by about 10:30 in the morning had begun to blanket the area with gritty, dusty ash. By mid-afternoon, day had turned to night as the ash blotted out the sun and the Yakima Valley was dark. It's been 30 years since that eruption of Mount St. Helens, and on this edition of Yakima Agenda, we're going to remember that day and those that followed. We are joined by Don Hinman, who was serving as Yakima's mayor pro tem at the time, Chuck Clarich, who was a Yakima County Commissioner in 1980, Dick Zase, who was then new to the job of Yakima City Manager, Ken Crockett, who was a reporter at KIMA TV, and also by Ken Rink, who was a young radio announcer on the air at KIT when the word of the eruption came across the news wire here in the Yakima Valley. First of all, I want to thank all of you for joining us on this 30th anniversary of the Mount St. Helens eruption. We're going to spend some time today remembering a little bit about what went on in your lives during that time. And the first question that I'd like each of you to respond to briefly is, where were you when you found out about the eruption? What were you doing at the time? And what did you do immediately after? And I'm going to start with Ken Rink, who was, as I mentioned, a radio announcer at KIT at the time, and probably one of the first people in the valley to even know of the eruption.
Well, I was alone at the radio station, and it was about, well, the mountain blew up at 8:32. I didn't find out about it until 8:44, when the Associated Press had sent out an old teletype on the newswire to tell everybody that the mountain blew up. And I just immediately started broadcasting whatever information I could get from the newswire. That was the only source of news that we had at that exact moment in time. And I decided to get a hold of Bud Graves, who worked out at the National Weather Service, and contact him because I figured that somebody would be out there looking at it on satellites and could tell us more information, particularly about which direction the winds were blowing. And so I got in touch with him and recorded all of this during that first hour. Unfortunately, with all the rush of everything that was going on in that first couple hours, we lost those first initial tapes. But we managed to record much of it after that. We just discontinued normal programming and interviewed citizens from the community. We tried to get officials to give us a call at the radio station. Al Bell was the news director at that time. He was there. Several of the other staff from KIT was present, and we just kind of did this on the fly. We didn't plan for it. We didn't know what to do about it. All we did is just gather information and rebroadcast it on the air.
And you guys did that for a solid week, it seems like, at least, round the clock.
Yeah, it was 5 days straight without commercials. And I can remember during that time we had a lot of the city and county officials call us, and in fact there were, as I recall, some meetings at the radio station where they came down and there was a conference table set up and they gave out the official information. But during those first few hours on Sunday, most people were at church. They were just getting up in the morning, and none of us were really set up and ready to go. In fact, the emergency broadcast system, as I recall, didn't even go off that morning. It may have later, but I just took the initiative and started doing whatever I could do to help out. But that's kind of what happened.
Wow. Well, Ken Crockett, where were you when you found out about the eruption and what happened?
Well, I found out I was at home. I got a call from Bob Romero, who worked at KIMA as a sportsman and as a reporter. He called about 9:30 and said, "Have you looked outside?" And I looked outside and it was kind of dark. And from there, went down to the TV station. I had a 3-week-old daughter, and of course you didn't want to breathe this ash, so I put on a cloth diaper and then proceeded to drive down Yakima Avenue, and the lights were on, and I think that day we interviewed somebody at the ER at St. Elizabeth, went out to the Weather Bureau, and then to the State Patrol. It was different. You know, that ash just came, and nobody seemed to know really what to expect or what to do, and it was our job to get the information on the air and try to report as best we could.
Now, how quickly did KIMA go on the air with this information? I assume there was some sort of interruption of programming, but did you wait until the regularly scheduled news time?
Oh, no, we were well into I think 11 o'clock. We were on all the stations at that time, you know, were interrupting their programming, and because that was the news of the day. It was one time that you really wondered if anybody was in control, because the streets were empty, people were told to stay in their house. We didn't know if this ash was going to take all the paint off, you know, building. There was just a lot of things that were going on at the time.
All right, let's move to the elected officials, and that's a whole nother side of this. We've got kind of media coverage of it, but what about the elected officials? Chuck, where were you when you heard?
I was at home in the Lower Valley, and I was a helicopter pilot down in the Southwest, and I can remember seeing these big clouds coming from the west towards us, and we looked out the window and we could see this big cloud over the mountains rolling towards us with lightning in it, and we were wondering what the heck was going on. And we got a phone call before noon from some friends down in Vancouver that said, the volcano erupted, St. Helens erupted, and it's rolling your way. And our youngest son was outside, and he came in and he says, Dad, it's raining dirt, that it had already started to fall. And so at that time, we were there in the house, and my first thought was, what do we do? We had tons of employees Monday morning that were going to be coming to the courthouse, and we had to come up with some strategy on how we were going to deal with it. So I got on the phone and talked to Graham Tollefson, and he and I talked a while, and it took us a while to catch up with Les Conrad. He was up in the Weenass.
Now, just to remind people, Graham Tollefson was a commissioner at the time, and Les Conrad.
We were the three commissioners at the time. And we talked a while and tried to decide what we were going to do, and so we tried to put the word out to the media to announce that the courthouse would be closed except for those emergency people that might need to show up. And so that was our process during the day. And then the next morning we were planning to meet early in the morning at the courthouse, the three of us, with the emergency people to try to set some strategy up on how we were going to deal with it.
And we'll talk a little bit about how Yakima and the Valley responded from an emergency standpoint in just a second. But Don, where were you?
I was just coming out of church, and a Herald Republic reporter also was a member of our church, and he came running back in and said to me, I just got a call from the Herald Republic. They're holding a plane for me, the Mountain Blue. And I can remember a bunch of us went outside the church, and Greta Bryan, who was also a member of our church, was also from Iowa, and I grew up in Nebraska, and we were both saying, this looks like a Midwestern thunderstorm beyond belief. And then all of a sudden we started seeing little flakes of ash coming down, and we were so excited about that, we actually took the minister's robe off and we were catching ash. And then all of a sudden we said, holy cow, this thing's big, and we need to all get home. So we all jumped in our cars, and by the time we got home, it was fairly dark, and dust was swirling around. And I remember listening to KIT all afternoon, all the information that was coming in. And I think one of the most famous quotes on KIT was Jack Getz, the owner of the station, saying, we need to remain calm. The whole mountain may be blowing up. The whole mountain range may be blowing up. The next morning when we came outside, we lived on Scenic Drive, and we could talk to people 2 blocks away. It was so dead silent. There weren't bird sounds, there weren't car sounds. It was amazing how silent it was. And my wife and I at the time owned 40 rentals, and we immediately thought we got to figure out how to handle this. Our response at first was like a snowstorm. You know, you could shovel it off the walks and that would be it. But all of a sudden it occurred to us to get it off the roofs. We experimented several ways. At first we sprayed it and it didn't work too well. Then we started catching on that if we just put a sprinkler up there and let the water trickle it off of the roof, it'd go on the ground. And it became really apparent that we really needed to clean the roofs off and then get the dirt out into the street so the city could come back up and do it. But I think it was probably Yakima's finest moment. Everybody pulled together, and it was also a great example of a city manager form of government. We on the council really decided quickly that we had to not only clean up the streets, but we had to clean off the roofs and get the stuff out in the street. And it became apparent that you really needed people who were technically capable of organizing all of the help that we got from all the other cities and get that organized, shut down the downtown area, get the sewage treatment plants so that that grit wasn't going through that. And then at the same time document it all so we could get our money back from FEMA. But it was a great example of using broad policy issues and at the same time using the technical help that the city staff, only the city staff really had the capabilities of doing, and it really turned out to be a great time.
Well, of course, the person that was at the head of running the city's response and the managing the technical capabilities and as I happen to know, documenting all of what was going on was Dick Zase. And Dick, at the time, you'd been in the job as Yakima City Manager for a little more than a year. Must have been quite a challenge, but tell us where you were when you found out, what you did immediately thereafter.
Sure. Well, I was actually home, like many of us here today, and was getting ready to have a barbecue in the early afternoon, and was out on the deck starting to clean it off, and I saw the cloud coming, and I thought, oh, this is going to ruin the barbecue, but the next thing was to notice the grit falling and the ash falling and wondering, gee, this is a heck of a thunderstorm. What could have brought this on? And it didn't occur to me until I did hear on the radio broadcast that it was St. Helens. I turned on the radio and heard that St. Helens had gone off. And still wasn't quite sure what that meant. And I think it was around 10:30, 11 that the police dispatch called me and wanted me to know that there were concerns about how far-reaching this could be and that this had the potential of being a huge event for our community. And I don't remember who the dispatcher was, but they had some insight into that. And the next thing I did was start making some calls to the mayor and letting Betty Edmondson know that this event had happened and that I would be mobilizing the city's department directors and emergency personnel as soon as possible for that afternoon. And I left home, and I think it was about noon that I drove on down to City Hall and began what was a very long week. I think my week was about 98 hours or so from that point forward. But we brought the city emergency departments together along with all the department directors and Betty, who was mayor, and notifying the council members that we were facing potentially a cataclysmic type experience, not knowing what it would mean. I also called my good friend, the library director, Dick Ostrander, and asked him if he had any insight and information on other volcanic eruptions on an urban area from the library world to see what research they might be able to provide. He came back a few hours and said, Dick, you're going to be the example for everyone in modern times because it hasn't really happened before in the last several hundred years. So that is what happened in the immediate aftermath. And we stayed together and worked on strategies and plans. Of course, as the day unfolded, it became dark and midnight. You've already explained the traffic lights going on. And we knew we needed to put out an emergency bulletin to city staff, and we decided to do that. We weren't quite sure if we would close down City
the city business district or the city until really late that evening, and realized that we had to do that. And we called for a press conference in the morning, and with the council coming into an emergency session, I asked the council for broad sweeping powers to help me and the staff respond to this emergency, of which it really was an event that you will never really forget. I think it's the first time the council ever has had to face a situation like that, and to coordinate with other governmental agencies and emergency facilities. As you've just also heard from Ken, the Emergency Operations Center wasn't really operating in Yakima at the moment that went off. I know they came together later on, but we were on our own, really, is what it came down to. And we linked together with the county, and we began to strategize on a plan for informing the community literally every day. We had a press conference arranged for the city and the county. The Chamber of Commerce, Gary Webster, was very helpful at the time of organizing the chamber. But we put together essentially a command center operation at City Hall, and then put together the kinds of resources to act and to begin strategizing and planning for what was necessary to address this emergency. Had the health district involved. Bob Atwood did some research on the potential health risks of volcanic ash, and those initial press conferences really kind of helped, I think, calm the waters, so to speak, but also put out the message on what kind of a strategy we were beginning to prepare for the cleanup, and closing down the city and the central business district for a cleanup that would entail all the things we've just started to talk about.
I remember where I was at the time. I was actually at church. I was a teenager, and one of the things that you've all touched on that was paramount, I guess, for those first, especially the first few hours, but even the first few days, and that was this concern over not knowing what the effects of the ash would be on people, on animals, on plants. But one of the things that I also thought was very interesting at the time was the concern that folks had about the effect on vehicles. And some of you share a little bit about how either your organizations responded, how you individually responded. How'd you protect your vehicles?
Well, let me just jump in real quick, take a turn here. That morning at KIT, as this progressed, the first couple of hours, those kinds of questions were already coming in on the telephone. People were worried about what was the makeup of the ash, what was the content, was it going to hurt us if we breathed it in. We were telling people, just put masks. If you have to go outside, put on a mask, but stay inside, close your doors, close your windows.
And where did you get that advice from?
I just told them that. I mean, it was just common sense. Stay inside, don't drive, just common sense stuff. But the questions started coming in about the vehicles. Is this stuff going to get in our carburetors? And maybe we should put pantyhose over the air filter and all this. And I don't know. I can't even recall if there was any engine damage as a result of this ash. But I know they closed down the airport. In fact, just to do a little bit of recollection in the short period of time we have left, the stores were running out of food. Everybody was ransacking the grocery stores in the next that day and the days that followed. Supplies weren't coming into the valley because the highways were closed. That wasn't until I think like Thursday, 4 days after the mountain blew. So it was a difficult time. I mean, the streets were closed down. People were wearing masks out there. They were brooming all of this ash. There was like 3 inches of it for the kids that are watching the show, 2 to 3 inches of heavy ash everywhere. It looked like the lunar surface. And they're sweeping it off the roofs and out into the street, and Dick could tell you, it made a mess.
Well, one of the things that it really caused a problem with was the sewage treatment plant.
Yes. As you were beginning to explore what to do and thinking about you got to do rooftops first and then the streets and sidewalks on cleanup, we were in our first debrief on what city facilities would be impacted. We made the decision early on to close the airport and to close and shut down transit and refuse service, but we still had to have other emergency operations, fire protection and the like, and we did get some notification that pantyhose on the intakes of the manifold would protect our major equipment and police cars, and it helped, actually. But we didn't really know about the treatment plant. The first concern was the water treatment plant. And we activated the backup wells for the city, which were below the surface and were impacted by the volcanic ash fall. We were concerned because there was a lot of processing of this going on at the water treatment plant. But the wastewater plant became a much bigger concern within a few days because the ash was flowing down into the storm drains and was starting to really contaminate and destroy the biological processes at the treatment plant. And in 3 days, we made a decision to shut the plant down because we were going to risk its entire destruction. And we bypassed the plant and diverted the raw sewage into the Yakima River. That happened to be at a time in which the stream flows are higher. The runoff from the mountains were higher. And I remember calling the Yakima Nation to tell them this, that we had to do this, or we could destroy the plant forever. Now, they were naturally very alarmed, but at least the ecology folks said, this is not as bad as it might seem because it's high river flows, the dilution process will be better. And within a week, we were able to get the plant back online and not have it run continuously for very long directly into the river.
What is, from an elected official standpoint, what was the central challenge that you faced, that the city council faced, that the county commission faced, from that particular perspective?
Well, I think the key for us was we have thousands of miles of road that all had ash on them. And I can remember getting up in the morning and driving to the courthouse on Monday. And when I got up and started out, it wasn't too bad, the dust in the air. But as soon as a few cars got going on the roads, there was a layer of dust over the whole valley. And so our concern was, how are we going to handle that? And we put the word out to try to acquire and get assistance from anybody that had water trucks and anybody that had a grader or something that might be able to help us clean off some of the roads so we can get the transportation going. The other thing that concerned me, and I didn't think of it right off the bat, right after it happened, my daughter was over at WSU and she called and she says, Dad, how's my horse doing? Take it and put it inside the barn. I heard over here that ash maybe could kill the animals. Well, again, we didn't have, Ken said, we didn't have, the information about what the effect of that ash was for a while until we finally got through the process and we understood that that really wasn't that much of a harm. You just had to be careful so you didn't ingest it.
I have a question, Mr. Claridge. Now, I know the city was engaged heavily on picking up all the ash, and they buried, and they could tell you the spots where they buried the ash. There would have been, 50 times that much ash that the county would have had to deal with. What did you guys do, and how did you do it?
Well, I think some in the urban area we probably, and I don't remember specifically, but in the urban area where there's a lot of residents, I'm sure we moved some of the ash out and haul it to wherever Dick said was all right to put it. But in the rural areas, if you went out for 2 or 3 or 4 years after the eruption and looked on the side of the road, you can find a layer of ash.
Yeah. So where'd you put it, Dick?
Well, I'll kind of back up for just a minute because the mobilization to do this was intense and significant. I contacted personally the city of Seattle, deputy mayor, who I knew, and John Spellman was county executive at the time, who I used to work for, and asked them to help. The city of Seattle, Multnomah County, and the city of Portland. And we organized a massive group of facilities, equipment, and resources to join us and put out the call for other private contractors like Chuck was mentioning for water trucks. But I want to mention the kind of equipment that was brought in here. 12 mobile street sweepers, 60 water and flush trucks, 25 large dump trucks, 12 front-end loaders, 8 graders, and 2 large vacuum units. This is in addition to the normal effort of the city and county that came from those resources that were brought into the city. They were mobilized at what is now the Public Works maintenance yard on Fruitvale Boulevard, and that was stationed there for 2 weeks. Well, we basically set up a plan working with the county and the business community to essentially design the cleanup effort into a grid system, block by block, neighborhood by neighborhood, and working with neighbors. But you had to have a plan that cleaned off the roofs first, as we've mentioned, sidewalks, and then move the ash out into the street apart from and separate from the curb, because you didn't want it going down into the storm drains. And then it was picked up, and the decisions was, with respect to where to put it, was where could we essentially deposit what amounted to, in the city, over 650,000 tons of ash. And the requests came in, and the first site that was identified was the infield to the Yakima County Fairgrounds. There's over 300,000 tons of ash located there. That infill filled up with the dump trucks going there. And then Chesterley Park on 40th and Fruitvale is another site that became another 250 to 300,000 tons. And some other private landfills were identified in the area. That's where the ash was deposited. By the way, I think after a week of doing that, we had a dump truck come in from a private party who said, "Fill it up. I'm heading to Chicago, New York, Boston. I'm going to sell it."
Take all you want.
I think one of the more humorous events was a fellow showed up out of the blue who called himself Santa Claus. And he made an announcement that he had a real plan for the city to preserve the ash before it was destroyed, and how to preserve it. And I can remember he even held a press conference, and when some of the media pressed him who he was, he became angry and said he was part of the CIA and he couldn't really divulge
Part of
much
the CIA?
part of his identity. And he also did a presentation in front of the council showing how plastics work and how to use the ash and with plastics and create all these unusual products. I had a coffee group in which Bob Clem was part of the group, and he was going to do a demonstration. Santa Claus was out at the ash dump on North 40th Avenue. And so our coffee group said, we got to get this guy, put him in his place. And so we organized the concept of Ethan Rabbit, and Bob Clem became Ethan Rabbit and got a huge rabbit suit. Roy Harold from Natchez arranged for a funeral home limousine, and then we had two women who I think one of them was Bob Clem's secretary dress up as belly dancers, and they had big long things with stuff. And as Santa Claus was setting up to do his demonstration to show the city council how to preserve the ash, Bob Clem showed up with the limousine and got out of the car, and immediately Santa Claus started putting all his stuff away and disappeared. But Bob was using a spray can spraying the earth, and it was really a
Do you guys
funny
remember that?
event.
Do you remember covering that?
I don't remember that, but.
Huh.
Yeah.
What were some of the other things though that?
I do remember that people's patience started to wear thin after this ash was laying around, and it wasn't like snow. It didn't go away, and then I think it kind of warmed up a little bit after the eruption, so it was kind of sticky and things. They started putting speed bumps on the residential streets.
Made out of the ash?
Made out of the ash, so cars would have to slow down when they're going down the road. And I remember it because I got a call from CBS, and they paid me $50 just to shoot cars going over speed bumps. And I thought that was the easiest $50 I ever made.
Where's that packet of ash? We need
Oh
to
yeah,
get that out here. Right?
We have a great little prop here that Ken Rank brought to us, and this is an actual package of the Mount St. Helens ash from that day. And something that's kind of interesting too, that not a lot of people know, I think, is that the ash that fell here was of one consistency. There we go, that's a little bit better. Yep. Was of one consistency, and other places around central Washington, it was much different. The further you moved east toward Moses Lake, kind of that basin, it was much more powdery than it was here. Anyway, I'll show that to folks so you can take a look at it.
An example of that is I've got 2 jars of this at home in my basement that I collected, but ours in Lower Valley was even lighter than the ones in Yakima. And we didn't have the problems down there with the swimming pools that they had up here. That heavy ash get on a swimming pool with a solar cover, and it basically sunk the solar cover.
By the way, Snowkist packaged this into cans and sold thousands of them across the country since they were interrupted from other types of packaging at the time. They did pretty well with it.
Well, now, Dick, we know how much you loved Mount St. Helens ash.
Yes.
Maybe if you'd open that packet for us, just dump it in your hand so we can all see how thick it is. We won't sneeze, we promise.
I'll let you do that.
Yeah.
But you're right about the experience of it diluting and becoming more powdery. If you went through Moses Lake and Ritzville, it became much more difficult to manage because it was really very, very much more powdery in substance, and you couldn't get it dampened down. Our process was to be sure that you had it dampened down to turn it into more manageable sand-like substance that you could manipulate and package up and dump into these vehicles for processing.
Well, and that's a big concern, because you put somebody running 40, 50 miles an hour with that real light ash that we had in Lower Valley, and you were behind them where they passed you.
Yeah.
It was just a cloud that rolled up.
Why
So you
not?
couldn't see anything. And there's some people just don't use their sense at all. They just keep going. And it's a wonder we didn't have many more accidents than we had.
We had one car that we actually left outside because we didn't have enough room in our garage. And that one car really did get ash into the heater system. And every time you turned on the heater, you would get dust coming out. And it continued until we actually sold the car. So it really did affect people in different ways, and the long-term effect is one of the more interesting things being an insurance agent is the insurance policies actually excluded volcanic damage. And one company, Safeco, which happened to be one of our companies, the insurance commissioner was really making the arguments that there was coverage on the policy. But one company, Safeco, decided immediately, within a day, that there was coverage and sent out a whole crew of adjusters to the insureds. And they settled claims for fraction of the than what other companies who later decided that they needed to follow suit and come in. And I can remember the same type of claim starting out, just settled for a few $100s. By the time the process ended a year later, where people were still turning in claims, those same claims were being, I shouldn't say this because everybody will want to reopen their things, we're actually settling in the thousands of dollars as each company decided that they would reinterpret the volcano exclusion, and as a result of that, the whole homeowners policy and the property policies were redesigned to better clarify how that volcanic exclusion worked. It's really amazing that an exclusion was written and nobody had ever experienced a volcano eruption, so they really didn't understand how you could read the language, and there was no real interpretation of it. And that's just one interesting sideline that occurred in the insurance industry.
Well, and by the way, if we hadn't told you up to this point, this edition of Yakima Agenda is brought to you by Safeco. No, it's just a free,
actually, Safeco doesn't exist.
Free plug that you provided that. Go ahead, Chuck.
Yeah, I think one other thing that I thought was interesting is that there was some real concern about the ash. But when the ash got in your lawn and the ash got in your garden and you mixed it in, it did a real good job of fertilizing that.
It did.
And I think that's why our valley is as fertile as it is. Yeah. Over the many generations and centuries, we've had enough ash in here that we've got some real fertile valley because of volcanic eruptions.
That is information that we found out later, Dick.
About 6 months after the disaster, we came across a publication from the U.S. Geological Survey, written in 1978, 2 years before the eruption, and it had an absolute prediction of what was going to happen, and they estimated that within the next 20 years, there'd be a major eruption, and that the ash cloud and the deposit of ash would migrate across the eastern part of the Northwest, and it was an absolute prediction that you couldn't have called any better in geologic time. Of course, it happened 2 years later. Nobody had ever seen that document, but they referenced the geological formation of the eastern part of this part of our world and talked about the rich soil that had been deposited here from previous generations of volcanic eruptions. And I think the last eruption of St. Helens was about 1855 or 1860. That was the only one that was really documented at the time. But that's the kind of history and interesting thing you find out is somewhere along the line somebody did a study, but it never was really distributed to know what you would do about it.
The other interesting point is, first week or so of June, I always go up to Bumping Lake. And we went up to Bumping Lake to go camping. And we went to the public side, if you've been up there. And there was ash on everything. There was a layer of ash on the tables, on everything. And so we went around to the other side, to the private side, the Bumping Lake Resort. They had washed everything off and so on. We camped there. We didn't have any problem. But it was deposited up in the mountains just as thick as it was down here.
Yeah, yeah.
Did anybody ever see, you got to remember, I was inside a studio, no windows at the radio station. So I wasn't really able to see what was going on the day that it erupted until I was able to take a break, and that was around 12 noon, so that was like 3 hours after. What's all this business about colored lightning? Did anybody see that?
Mm-hmm. That coming over the, well, where I live, you look out across the Yakima Reservation up to the mountains. Coming that direction, that cloud was just rolling as it would roll with the dust storm. And the lightning was different colored lightning strikes back and forth, and I think it was the static electricity in those clouds with that ash that was in it. And as further away you got, the heavy ash had to fall first. And then the further away you got, and when you got over by Ritzville and that, they had a tiny, tiny layer. And I had some friends that were up there by Ritzville, and they ended up 3 days and staying in the school gym because they couldn't get out because the roads were so bad until they cleaned the roads off to get them home.
Yeah, that lightning that was present in the clouds and the thunder, I remember that being at church and the windows of our church literally almost coming out of their frames because of that thunder. That's part of the reason why so many people in the valley mistook that cloud for a huge thunderstorm coming. And it was quite surprising. I think a lot of people didn't actually find out that it was not going to be a thunderstorm until they didn't know it wasn't going to be until they heard it on KIT.
And that's the same thought I had. I was a helicopter pilot down in Texas and Oklahoma, and you had those huge thunderstorms come in. Yeah. And there was times I was out flying a helicopter and one of those storms moved in. First thing I did is put the helicopter on the ground because you get in that wind and then up those updrafts, it just wipes you out. And that's exactly what I thought it was just another blue norther coming in as it used to down.
Now, Ken, you were out in the field taking all these pictures and getting news. Do you remember what it smelled like out there?
It had a sulfur, smell to it.
Like matches.
Yeah, like matches, just like you'd struck a match, and it was, it was a sulfury smell and it dusty, and of course we were concerned about our cameras and equipment because that gritty stuff just got into everything.
For those first few days that you were out providing coverage, were the streets fairly bare? You mentioned that day, but for the next couple of days, or did activity kind of start coming back?
Activity, started to come back after everybody realized that, we're going to survive and that the end of the world hadn't come. But at times you wondered, at least on the day when the mountain blew, because we were kind of on our own. And activity did come back. And for some not fast enough, but I remember the downtown being shut down for a week. It was extensive to clear things off roofs and buildings and do all of that.
I think
probably, I don't have a field to push the dirt into.
I think probably kind of the human factor is that for the first time, even though I had lived in my house for several years, I really didn't know a single neighbor personally. And by the end of the first day, I knew them all. And we were all comparing notes. We were all talking about it and offering each other advice on how to clean stuff up. And it was really an event where everybody in town really pulled together. I don't remember that many people that were really disgruntled. They all realized we were in this together, and we were all figuring out ways to solve the problem. I do remember Betty Edmondson calling me and saying, you know, I just got a call from the bond raters, which were rating the bond capacity of the city of Yakima, calling us and saying, you know, some of the figures that are coming out of Yakima, how many dollars worth of damage, is really, they're really questioning whether they should downgrade our bond rating. And I can remember Betty asking us council members to go around and ask people, don't give a dollar estimate to the damage, because this really could affect us for years to come on just the financial, what we would have to pay on interest on eventually on the sewer treatment bonds. And those were the kinds of things that people really responded to and really paid attention to, helping out and holding things together. It's very rare in city politics that you get people pulling together. Most of the time there's always somebody second guessing what you're doing.
Dick, you had a comment.
Well, I was going to say the economic side of this is significant. There was a headline in the Post-Intelligencer. It was about 5 days after the eruption, and it said, "Farms are dying in the ash." And that hit the eastern markets, and there was great worry that this would be a huge economic impact, let alone the health risks that were still being determined. But at the end of the day, when it was all finally calibrated, I think the economic loss to the valley was about $12 million. The health risks were minimal to humans and animals. There was no loss of life, thankfully, for this event. We had the city cleaned up basically and back in operation in a week, and the county in the same vein was really doing its part to open up the county roads. But we were working hard to document all of this, to try to be sure we had everything in place to seek whatever financial recourse we had. The final cost for the city was about $5.5 million, and the biggest share of that, over $3 million of it, was at the wastewater treatment plant. And you're working through these issues of documentation and working with FEMA. By the way, it's the one time the city and the county together called out the National Guard. Not for so much for public safety, but for help with logistics, cleanup, and all of those things. And they did a tremendous job along with our police and other forces. But we also had to work with the federal agencies. And that's a story in itself, once you're documenting all your expenses. Literally about 3 months before the eruption, there had been a change in the reimbursement formula for local government recovery from emergencies. The state at one time was at 25%, and that got dropped down to 5% or so. So both the city and county at some point had what was deemed to be about a 75% reimbursement from the federal agencies, and it would be 25% from the locals. It actually turned out to be more than that because of the non-reimbursable expenses. And among those that I always remember is that shovels were not reimbursable, but brooms were, because the brooms would wear out, and the shovels you can use for another day. And those are the kinds of examples that would frustrate you. Masks, I will tell you this story. We called the 3M company from our offices to ask if they could donate masks to our community. And they sent 3 million masks to this area, to the emergency services office, and distributed them for free. They deserve some recognition for that across the valley. But it took an enormous amount of time, energy, logistics, coordination. But really, in 2 weeks, we had this community up and running again. And as Donna said, and it's been noted here many times, the community response was incredible. And it's where government could show its purpose, as well as the community coming together, citizens, government, private sector, business alike, to be able to unify on a common objective. Once we knew the imminent threat of potential life was not that serious, but it was what we needed to do to get ourselves back working and being a productive community again. That's what was the great showcase of the effort.
Nick, we should have brought our masks. I still have some left over.
Yes, I know. I have a few too.
Could have worn them today.
Yeah.
Well, it definitely was a huge moment in the history of Yakima, and it has defined a part of the history of Yakima. And I think likewise for each of you here, the event of Mount St. Helens erupting on May 18th, 1980 has defined a portion of your life. I appreciate you coming today, sharing a little bit of the memories of that time with us, and this conversation could continue to go on, and hopefully sometime in the future we'll ask you all back and we'll do it again. But I appreciate you joining us here today, and we will see you next time on the next edition of Yakima Agenda.
The preceding program was a production of Y-PAC, Yakima Public Affairs Channel. If you have questions about the program or would like to purchase a VHS or DVD copy, please call 575-6092.